So welcome, Marcia. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Valma. My name is Dr. Marcia Morgan, and I work for the Prison and Probation Service. I've worked with them for over 15 years. I've also lectured at the University of East London. I joined the organisation because I, at the time, was naive enough to believe that I could empower African Caribbean men who had committed crime and were incarcerated, and I felt I could empower them through education to live law abiding lives. So that's what was the drive for me for joining the organisation. My reason for completing my PhD, which looked at black women as gendered and racialized subjects through the lens of intersectionality and organizational psychodynamics, which in a simple sense is just looking at how an organization experiences someone that is different based on race and gender, but also how that person experiences working in that organization, which is white, male dominated.
How your journey towards your PhD in terms of professional development and personal development.
Sure. So I was doing my master's degree, which I was looking at leadership and management in education, and I focused on prison education because that was an area of my interest. I realized that there were no studies that actually looked specifically at black women as employees in prison occupational literature. There was just nothing there whatsoever. So when I looked at gender studies, for example, women as governors, all the women were white. There were no black women. When I looked at the HMIP Inspectorate Report in 2004, which was a thematic review of race relations in prisons, we had a category of staff, and you had BME staff, which was the term used at that time, and you had white staff. But there was you couldn't tell, there was no differentiation between black women and black men and white women and white men in the staff group. So it was as though there's this monolithic view of race. Race has no gender. It's just genderless. It's just a race. Important for me to show that race is gendered and gender is raced.
How did you move towards from your master's to do your PhD?
Well, my journey was quite unique in regards to, I completed my master's, I was having a conversation with someone and they literally said to me, so when are you going to start your PhD? And then I thought, actually, I should do a PhD because I want to make black women visible in prison occupational literature. I want to make a contribution. Yes. So and my persona is very much, if I want to do something, I will find a way to do it. So I first wanted to find a supervisor that I felt would understand my research I was interested in. And at first I was just interested in black women working in the prison service. So I spent a lot of time looking at different supervisors who had done research in either gender or race. And I came across Dr. Gail Lewis. At the time, she was working at Lancaster University, and by the time I started my PhD, she had moved to the Open University. So I did my PhD at the Open University. Now, that's an unusual method to get into doing a PhD because usually you would apply to a university and then you would be assigned a supervisor. I did it the other way around because for me, it was more important to have the right supervisor as opposed to the university where I would be studying or completing the PhD. So when I submitted my proposal to Dr. Gail Lewis, she was quite interested in it, and we spoke, and I explained to her my interest, and she was like, actually, submit this to the university because I think they would be interested. Oh, plus I did my research, so I looked at different routes of doing a PhD. Right. I was partially funded by the organisation that I work for, so the prison service partially funded my PhD. That again was something where people have said to me that's never happened before, unless you do your PhD through the prison service, and again they would then allocate the university, allocate your supervisor, and then they would own all that intellectual property. Because I had done it a different way, in which I had identified my supervisor, I had submitted my application, I was successful, they were just paying, partially funding the studies. as opposed to me
Okay.
doing the PhD as a professional development. So I did my PhD in a full sense, in the traditional sense of a distance PhD, as opposed to a continuous professional development route. And the reason
Okay.
why I chose that route was so that I had the autonomy to be able to place black women at the center of the research.
And based on your research, how have you took it forward in terms of influencing policy, but also influencing organisational development around diversity and race, as well as gender?
Well, one of the things that I had spent a lot of time sort of advocating for was the use of an intersectionality framework in understanding the differences between different ethnic groups and gender groups. So, for example, a lot of organizations will either compare gender, so men against women, or race, black, or the political term BAME in the UK, BAME versus white. Now, we know, for example, within the BAME group, it's made up of various different ethnic groups. We also know, as black women, we can't be one day black and one day a woman. So what I've always tried to do, and what I've done through my research, and what something that has actually started to happen now, is you would have seen the use of intersectionality. 5 years ago, that term was not really known in the UK. Even in 2 years ago, if I take my organisation for example, we were not using an intersectional framework to look at our staff demographics. Now we are. Now we're actually looking at an ethnic breakdown, not just black, not just BAME and white, but we're actually looking at the various categories within the BAME group. We're also looking at the difference between black women and black men. That hadn't happened for a very long time. I mean, I can recall having a meeting with my previous permanent secretary, Sir Richard Heaton, and explaining to him the importance of using an intersectional framework to actually understand the disparities between the different ethnic groups and also between different ethnic groups and gender in order to have a fuller picture of what was happening and how his staff was experiencing the Ministry of Justice. Now we're starting to see more of a momentum with more and more organisations using an intersectional framework to actually understand what the data is telling them in regards to staff.
To the gender thing. So I had a fascinating chat with a woman who works in part of my department, works in the prison service, and she's done a PhD about the experience of black women in the prison service. And she says too often, or very often, the discourse in an organisation like the prison service about race is actually quite patriarchal, and she feels invisible as a black woman. Do you ever feel the kind of double jeopardy of gender and race, or do you separate the two things, or do you find them related?
Okay, so I mean, congratulations, and to be able to work in an environment where there's so many challenges, particularly in the area of diversity and fighting inequalities and social justice, is always going to be a challenge. But the fact that you've looked specifically at institutional and organisational inequalities across gender and race, that's amazing. And I'd like to thank you so much for taking your time. The fact that you've got children and you're able to do this, and as a black woman, I think you've done amazing. And I just hope that AUK Radio continues to bring people like yourself on to share your experience, your knowledge and expertise. So thank you so much, Dr. Morgan, for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. If I could just say one last thing to your listeners, and one of the things that I always say to people is that you should be inspired by my journey. And regardless of what someone says to you that you cannot do something, stay focused so that you can fulfill your purpose. Because there'll be barriers and challenges, and I was told that I couldn't do a PhD, and I have a PhD. So if someone tries to throw salt on your dreams, stay focused and you'll get there in the end.
Well, you just scraped the salt off.
Yeah.